The fog lifted at 8:47 in the morning on December 17, 1944. Sergeant Jim Morrison blinked into the cold Belgian air and saw the tank. It was 300 yards away, pushing through the frozen forest with the slow, mechanical confidence of a machine that believed nothing on earth could stop it. Behind the first tank came another, then a third, 3 German Panzers grinding forward toward the thin American line that had been holding this sector since the German offensive began. Morrison had been infantry for 2 years. He had seen tanks before. He knew exactly what they meant for men armed only with rifles. They meant death. But that morning, Morrison was holding something new, something the Germans did not yet understand. And within seconds, the balance between infantry and armor would change forever. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had entered one of its most brutal phases. The Allied armies had pushed across France after the Normandy invasion, but the war was far from over. German forces still possessed one terrifying advantage: their tanks. The Panzer had become one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield, heavily armored, powerfully armed, and often nearly invulnerable to ordinary infantry weapons. For American soldiers fighting in forests, towns, and hedgerows, the sight of German armor approaching usually meant only one thing: you were about to face a problem you could not solve. Infantry rifles bounced harmlessly off tank armor. Machine gun bullets did nothing. Even grenades required getting dangerously close to a moving vehicle protected by machine guns. For most infantrymen, there were only 3 realistic choices when tanks appeared: hide and hope the tanks passed, run and hope you were faster than their guns, or stand and die. Sergeant Morrison had seen all 3 outcomes across France and Belgium. He had watched friends try to run. He had watched others hide. He had buried men who had never really had a chance. But on this freezing December morning, Morrison had something different lying beside him in his foxhole. A weapon that American engineers had created to solve one of the most deadly problems in modern warfare: how to give ordinary infantry the power to kill tanks. The weapon Morrison held looked familiar. It was the M1A1 bazooka. American soldiers had been using the bazooka since 1942. In theory, it was a revolutionary weapon, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that allowed infantry to attack armored vehicles. But in practice, the early bazooka had a serious problem. It often did not work. The original rockets could penetrate roughly 80 millimeters of armor. That had been enough earlier in the war. But German engineers had improved their tanks rapidly. The Panzer IV now carried armor roughly 80 millimeters thick at the front. The newer Panther tank carried even more protection, often exceeding 100 millimeters. Suddenly, American rockets were striking tanks and simply bouncing off. Infantry reports began describing the same depressing pattern again and again. Direct hit, flash of sparks, tank keeps moving. Bazooka teams became extremely dangerous assignments. A soldier had to expose himself to fire the weapon. If the rocket failed to penetrate, the tank's machine guns usually answered immediately. Many bazooka gunners died without ever knowing if their shot had worked. Morale suffered. Confidence in the weapon collapsed. By late 1944, some commanders had stopped assigning bazooka teams at all. The weapon had become more psychological than practical. Fire the rocket. Hope the tank crew became cautious. Then run while you still could. But deep inside American weapons laboratories, engineers had been working on a solution. A completely new type of warhead. A design based on physics that most soldiers had never even heard of. The shaped charge. The new rocket issued to Morrison that morning looked almost identical to the older ammunition. But inside the warhead, something extraordinary had changed. The round was called the M6, a 3-high explosive anti-tank rocket. Instead of relying on brute force, the weapon used one of the most elegant pieces of battlefield physics ever discovered. Inside the warhead was a carefully shaped cone of explosive, lined with a thin layer of copper. When the rocket struck a tank and detonated, The explosion did not spread outward in all directions. Instead, the shape of the explosive forced the energy forward. The copper lining collapsed inward under enormous pressure. For a fraction of a second, the metal behaved like a fluid. The collapsing copper formed an incredibly fast jet of superheated metal. This jet traveled at roughly 25,000 feet per second, more than 7 times the speed of sound. The jet was thinner than a pencil, but its energy was concentrated into a tiny point. When it struck armor, it did not bounce. It did not hammer. It simply forced the steel apart, punching through armor by concentrating unbelievable pressure into a microscopic area. The result was devastating. The new rocket could penetrate around 100 millimeters of armor, enough to kill nearly any German tank then fighting in Europe. Even more important, the effect worked regardless of armor angle. The technology was so valuable that it was kept highly secret. Units receiving the rockets were warned never to let an unfired round fall into enemy hands. Sergeant Morrison did not know any of this. All he knew was that 3 German tanks were getting closer, and he had 12 rockets beside him. The lead Panzer rolled closer through the frozen forest. 200 yards, then 150. Sergeant Morrison could now see details on the vehicle's steel hull. Frost clung to the armor plates. The tracks crushed frozen earth with a grinding metallic rhythm. Behind the first tank, the second and third vehicles followed in formation. German infantry moved cautiously behind them. The tanks were the spearhead. The infantry was there to clean up whatever resistance remained. This was how armored warfare had worked for years. Tanks advanced. Infantry scattered. Then the tanks finished the job. From Morrison's foxhole, the situation looked hopeless. 3 tanks against a thin line of American infantry. Under normal circumstances, the outcome would already be decided. But Morrison had the bazooka resting across his shoulder, and inside that launcher was a weapon no German tanker yet understood. He lifted the tube carefully. The bazooka was not complicated. Point. Estimate range. Squeeze the trigger. The rocket motor would ignite and send the projectile racing toward the target in less than a second. But firing the weapon came with a deadly trade-off. The rocket left a long trail of white smoke. That smoke instantly revealed the shooter's position. If the rocket failed to destroy the tank, the gunner rarely survived long enough to fire again. Morrison settled the launcher against his shoulder. The lead Panzer was now less than 100 yards away. The tank turret began to rotate slowly, scanning the forest for American positions. Morrison aimed directly at the front of the tank, the thickest armor, the place where older bazooka rounds had failed again and again. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket launched with a sharp blast of smoke and flame. For a moment, Morrison watched the trail streak toward the tank. The distance closed in less than a second. Then the rocket struck. Morrison expected the familiar disappointment, a flash, a shower of sparks, a tank that continued moving. Instead, something very different happened. The impact produced a sharp cracking sound, but there was no massive explosion, no dramatic fireball. For a brief moment, it looked as if nothing had happened. Then the Panzer shuddered. The tank slowed and stopped. Inside the vehicle, the shaped charge had done exactly what American engineers promised. The copper jet punched through the frontal armor. It entered the crew compartment, moving faster than a rifle bullet. Anything in its path was instantly destroyed. The driver died immediately. The jet continued through the interior of the tank and struck stored ammunition. A moment later, smoke began pouring from the hatches. Flames followed. The tank had not exploded outward. Instead, it was dying from within. The interior temperature rose rapidly. Ammunition began detonating inside the hull. Within seconds, the entire vehicle had become a furnace. The crew never escaped. Sergeant Morrison stared in disbelief. He had seen bazooka hits before. They rarely did anything. But this time the tank was burning. The weapon had worked. The 2nd Panzer commander saw what happened to the lead tank. For a moment he hesitated. A tank destroyed by infantry weapons was something German crews rarely experienced. But what happened next was even more shocking. The commander ordered his driver to reverse. A German Panzer retreating from infantry, from a bazooka, from a weapon that had been considered ineffective for most of the war. The commander did not understand what had destroyed the first tank, but he knew it came from somewhere in the American lines. And that meant the danger still existed. Morrison was already loading another rocket. The process was quick. Insert the rocket, lock it into place, raise the launcher. The second tank was reversing quickly now, trying to retreat behind the tree line, but Morrison had a clear shot. He fired again. The rocket struck the Panzer in its side armor. Unlike the front, the side plates were thinner. The shaped charge punched through effortlessly. This time, the result was immediate. The copper jet struck fuel lines inside the tank. Flames erupted. Within seconds, the vehicle exploded into a fireball that lit the winter forest. 2 tanks destroyed, less than 30 seconds apart. The third Panzer did not wait. Its commander immediately ordered a retreat. The tank turned and began pulling away from the American positions. The German infantry behind the armor suddenly found themselves exposed. Without tanks to protect them, they faced rifle fire from American soldiers who now knew their anti-tank weapons actually worked. The attack stalled, then collapsed. The German assault reversed direction. Morrison lowered the bazooka slowly. 10 rockets still lay beside him, but the battle in that sector was already over. Sergeant Morrison remained in his foxhole with the bazooka still warm in his hands. 2 German tanks burned in the frozen forest. A third was retreating. For the first time since the German offensive began, American infantry had stopped an armored attack without help from artillery or tanks. What Morrison had just done was something infantry had rarely been able to do in modern warfare. He had destroyed tanks using a weapon he carried on his shoulder. News spread quickly along the American lines. Soldiers began passing the story from foxhole to foxhole. The new rockets worked. The bazooka finally worked. Men who had once dreaded the appearance of German armor suddenly realized they had a weapon capable of fighting back. The change in morale was immediate. Infantry units that once felt helpless now had confidence. Bazooka teams that once felt like suicide assignments suddenly became valuable assets. But the psychological shift did not affect only the Americans. German tank crews noticed something had changed almost immediately. Reports began reaching German commanders that tanks were being destroyed by infantry rockets, not by artillery, not by other tanks, by soldiers hiding in foxholes. For armored crews, this was deeply unsettling. Tanks had dominated infantry since their first appearance in the First World War. Their armor made them nearly immune to ordinary soldiers. Now that advantage was disappearing. German crews began reacting cautiously. Tank commanders started closing their hatches earlier. They reduced visibility, but increased protection from the mysterious weapon capable of punching through their armor. Some units even began waiting for their infantry to clear defensive positions before advancing. The entire rhythm of armored warfare began to shift. The Germans soon developed their own name for American soldiers armed with the improved rockets. They called them Panzer Killers. The name was not meant as praise. It was an admission of fear. A tank crew could no longer assume that infantry was harmless. Every ditch, hedge, or foxhole might contain a soldier carrying a weapon capable of destroying their vehicle. The result was hesitation, and hesitation on the battlefield could be deadly. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces relied heavily on armored spearheads to break through American lines. Speed was essential. Tanks had to move quickly before Allied forces could organize resistance, but the appearance of effective anti-tank rockets slowed those advances. Tank commanders became cautious. They hesitated before pushing forward. They waited for reconnaissance. They searched for hidden rocket teams. That hesitation bought precious time for American defenders. The new bazooka ammunition did not win the Battle of the Bulge by itself. No single weapon ever wins a war, but it gave infantry units something they had not possessed before: options. Surrounded American soldiers who would once have been helpless against armor could now fight back. German tanks that once advanced confidently now faced unexpected resistance. The battlefield equation had changed. The technology behind the M6A3 rocket remained classified for decades after the war. Military planners understood immediately how important the shaped charge principle was. The ability to defeat heavy armor using focused explosive energy would influence weapon design for generations. Modern anti-tank systems all trace their origins back to that same concept. Rocket-propelled grenades, wire-guided missiles, advanced weapons like the TOW or Javelin all rely on variations of the shaped charge idea first used in weapons like the improved Bazooka rocket. But the legacy of the weapon was not only technical, it was human. The shaped charge allowed a rocket weighing just a few pounds to destroy machines weighing tens of tons. It allowed a soldier hiding in a frozen foxhole to defeat armored vehicles that once seemed unstoppable. That shift changed the relationship between infantry and armor permanently. But the cost of that change was carried by the men who used the weapon. The shaped charge did not simply penetrate tanks. It turned their interiors into furnaces. The superheated copper jet ignited fuel, detonated ammunition, and destroyed everything inside the vehicle. Soldiers like Morrison learned to recognize the signs of a successful hit. The sudden silence of a stopped engine, the smoke rising from hatches, sometimes the screams that came from inside before ammunition detonations ended everything. These were the details rarely discussed in official reports, but they stayed with the soldiers long after the war ended. Sergeant Morrison survived the Battle of the Bulge. By the end of the campaign, he was credited with destroying several enemy tanks. He received a Bronze Star and a promotion, but like many veterans, he rarely spoke about the experience. Friends and family later said he carried the memories quietly for the rest of his life. The nightmares did not disappear when the war ended. The physics of the weapon had worked perfectly. The psychological cost was harder to measure. Today, the M6A3 rocket sits quietly in military museums. Visitors walk past it as just another piece of World War II equipment. A simple rocket weighing only a few pounds. But that small weapon changed the battlefield forever. It proved that even the most powerful machines could be defeated by the right idea and the right technology. And it reminded the world that every breakthrough in warfare comes with a human cost. So here is a question worth thinking about. If you had been in Sergeant Morrison's foxhole that morning in Belgium, holding a weapon you had never tested in battle before, would you have trusted it enough to fire? Or would you have waited for someone else to prove it worked? Let me know your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy deep historical stories about the technology and people that shaped warfare, make sure to subscribe for more documentaries like this.